construction makers.
So something we talk about a lot is that when you have a framework or you have sort of forces put upon a design that you're working on, it can impact that design. And one thing that I have been thinking a lot about is how the sort of physicality or the permanence of Magic affects their design philosophies. And when we look at it in contrast with digital media's design philosophies in terms of sort of this rapid prototyping approach of like minimum viable product, get it out there as quickly as possible, and then iterate on it once it's live, Magic doesn't get to do that. Day one, the product has to be a particular level of quality, or it just doesn't end up functional at all. And since there's this kind of resistance to bringing the product to market, you end up with a heavier emphasis on quality of design.
Before we get into today's video talking about the importance of physical design for games, please, if you like our content, give us a like and subscribe.
Also, this episode is brought to you by...
It's brought to you by me and my playmat series. There's a link in the description to go to the pre-launch page so you can be notified when the Kickstarter goes live. Oftentimes, I think if you were to reverse it in the video game landscape, every studio has their own structure when it comes to producing and developing a video game. But a lot of the times, the quality aspect, quality control, as it gets out, and the fine-tuning comes much later down the line. And whereas I think in a lot of cases for Magic, not only does it help that they're constantly updating an existing system, systems design and fine-tuning that I think would have to be happening at a much earlier stage. But for the most part in video games, you look at like QA or quality assurance and stuff, and a lot of that is on the later end of development. It's after a lot of these things have sort of been implemented. A lot of the design decisions have, for the most part, been formalized, maybe not completely finalized, but they're in the process of being worked on. Whereas in Magic's case, I think they need to hit that much, much sooner.
Right. I mean, it does make some amount of sense that like they have sort of this system that they're able to like, okay, well, we're working from a certain level of things that have already been figured out over the last 30 years. But then the new stuff that we're introducing to that system is what needs to get tested. And I think that, we can talk about Magic's sort of design structure for a minute in terms of the way that their company is structured to sort of facilitate some of this higher demand, I think, on design from the initial release of the product. We look at, it starts with vision design. This is sort of where Mark Rosewater is, where he, the team at Vision Design is sort of coming up with what the set is ultimately going to look like. It's the vision. Yeah. And we get into set design, which is sort of designing the specific mechanics and archetypes that are going to come up in that set. And that's sort of informed by the vision of the set. And then you have play design, and those are the people who are figuring out sort of the nitty gritty, mana costs and exactly how the game is going to, what's going to actually be printed onto the cards in its final form. And if we contrast that with sort of the way that a video game pipeline might work, and don't get me wrong, there are additional things to consider with a video game pipeline in terms of like, player interaction with a character and a world in which the character exists in, and there's a lot of different disciplines at play here. But if we're looking specifically at like systems design pipelines, what does it end up looking like in a video game space rather than Magic? Right.
And the toughest thing with video game space is that, looking at Magic as an example versus video games, both of them have investors that they have to appease to. And so they need to show progress to those investors over time. So in a video game space, even if it might initially look very similar in that it's probably working on systems design, let's say it's an existing live service game, so they don't even have to work necessarily on that.
That's probably pretty similar to what Magic would be.
So we'll say that they don't have to work on systems design at all, but if they're coming up with some sort of a feature, what they probably need to do in order to sell that is create some sort of aesthetics or art to go along with that. Because you have the team going along this whole time. And so what Magic kind of gets the luxury of being able to do is that they have an entire concept team that what they're doing is they're trying to fill out this world that then is going to be sent off, where the majority of the art is going to be lots of illustrations. Whereas in a video game space, there is that like development time where it's like, oh, we're going to figure out what this is going to look like. But because it's so directly tied to how the game plays, in order to show that and show progress up to, up the ladder and show, oh, this is what we're working on, you need to have animation, you need to have a model, you need to have all of these things ready to go in that video game space. And so like, it's going, you can't stop it, right? But in Magic's space, because it's so kind of not necessarily separated, but because it all stems from that top vision design, that you need to know what the set is going to be, and what the feeling is going to be, so that it can trickle down into not only art, but also design. And a lot of the times in a video game space, that doesn't necessarily happen. Things are, you need to kind of come up with the design and the art simultaneously a lot of the times.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about the two different processes and then where emphasis ends up being placed, right? Because when you have sort of this investment that's lead up to, hey, here's this thing that we're working on, and then we're prototyping and getting it to the point where it's presentable for somebody to sign off on it.
Yeah,
that's a much different pipeline than it is with Magic, where Magic is like, well, we can print off playtest cards and be able to sort of work through whether or not this sort of mechanic is going to work with very little investment.
Yeah.
But we're moving that investment to when we're actually producing the physical product. And I think that's such an interesting pressure that's put on design in different ways, where it feels like in a video game space, you're almost like locked into design sooner.
Yeah.
But then you're able to change it after release, right?
Yeah.
Where you can patch the game, right? And with physical media, you can errata, right? We've seen that happen every now and then, but it's like a really bad form, right?
Yeah.
Like, and a lot of players literally will never see it. They'll have the card that in the way that it was printed, and that's how they will think that the card works.
Right.
And so when we look at kind of the design processes and the emphasis on where these things are put, I do think that in a video game space, we see, I think, a bit too much emphasis on locking down a design idea right away.
Yeah.
And it makes sense when you have to have sort of monetary investment made even manifest that thing into here's what it is.
Right. In a card game, right, or a physical game at all, you could write everything down on cards, postcards, sticky notes, whatever, and you could make sure your game functions in that way. In a video game space, you might be able to use gray boxes or basic models or whatever.
Right.
But for the most part, to really make sure that you have things down, you're going to have things visually being made, in which case, once that budget is sort of spent, depending on the company and their process and what's going on, a lot of the times that budget's spent.
It's like locked in.
Yeah, it's like, all right, well, we worked on this character. Like, do you want to lose all these, hundreds of thousands of dollars spent to make this?
Right. I guess what's weird, right, in the situation is with digital media, you're kind of locked into an idea, but then you can change it afterward, right?
Right.
And so you're never like really locked in, you know? And I do wonder about like how much of that structure for Magic has come from being able to stay in design iteration land for a longer period of time because it's necessary to do so, because you can't make that change post-release.
Right. Yeah.
That's the part where I'm like, okay, well, what can we take from tabletop to bring into the digital space in terms of that philosophy? I
mean, I think it's you see a lot of success with different video game studios that their process emphasizes design much sooner.
Sure.
And also doesn't really care as much about implementing assets and aesthetics any time soon in the development of a game, right? Yeah. Not only that, but like we talk all the time about how like a design influences the narrative, and so making sure that on a physical game, I'm sure Magic at this point is a much bigger game, has a much larger team, but it's probably still a small enough team that they can probably communicate. Teams can probably hear about what other teams are working on, and you can't make a card without having a visual in mind, probably, or a narrative or an aesthetic in mind, and that's going to have to be interpreted by an artist at some point, meaning that you have an opportunity to make sure that these two things are going to connect really, really well.
Well, and the sort of separation of disciplines is also something that needs to be considered here. here, right?
Yeah.
It's that like, okay, well, in video game space, there's so many different disciplines that have to sort of all come together to make anything coherent. It's
Yeah.
almost a miracle that anything coherent actually even comes out of it at the end.
Yeah.
And that, with Magic, it's like, okay, well, you have design and you have art, right? But then design has different layers to it, right? Vision, set, experience, all this stuff. I would wager a guess. Obviously, I don't work at Wizards, but I would wager a guess that those designers all sort of are multiple have multiple disciplines and also can kind of like have some sort of fluid movement through all those different types of design.
Yeah.
Where if you look at something like video games, somebody who's like a level designer and a narrative designer, they're not gonna change jobs, right? Or at least very rarely.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot more. It's a lot more specific. What they need to ideally be good at or understand as far as their specific design roles go. Yeah. And yeah, it gets to be much more fine-tuned. That like this, as far as Magic's pipeline goes, has been the most specificity they've seemed to have in their development process. But yeah, video games, I mean, I think as an example, the team I'm on, I think I could talk about that.
Maybe.
I don't know why I wouldn't. Like for instance, on World of Warcraft, the team that I work on, our design team, we have like 17 different design positions, something like that. Might not be that many, but I think last time I counted, it was around 15, 17, something like that. And that's crazy. That's like a wide variety, but you need that specificity. When you have like such a large game and you have so many people as a part of it, you need to start figuring out who's going to handle this one role.
Right. And you sort of need to specialize people into that role so that one, all your bases are covered, but by allowing someone to specialize into such a specific niche, they can become very good at it.
Yeah.
Where when you're looking at, I guess too, I wonder about clarity in design vision in terms of like what Magic ends up having to do pre-product release versus post, because you can't change anything. Right. So in order for a product to come out, a set to come out that is 100% coherent and like ready to go from day one, there's a lot more sort of like, we know that they appoint certain people to lead sets.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about, I assume that person follows the set through the whole process.
Right.
In terms of like vision all the way through to play design. And with that sort of singular vision, obviously there's game directors and things, but I do wonder about a particular section of a game or a particular set, maybe, or expansion in World of Warcraft's case. I wonder about the sort of clarity of a singular vision coming through, and I think it's more difficult for that to happen in video games just because you have so many different disciplines, you have so many different leaders of those disciplines trying to all, lead the specific thing that they do, and I think you have much less crossover in terms of like, all right, well, if we have a design vision lead in Magic, they're seeing the set through the whole process, where if you have a lead of environment or a lead of narrative, they're not, the game director, I think theoretically is the person who's doing that, but in some ways they can't, because it's so complex, because there's so many things going on, they're not going to be able to necessarily have control over every individual thing in that way, unless you're Miyazaki, and then it's a whole nother.
I was going to say, I think like looking at Miyazaki as an example of this, that like, I think the team that FromSoft has for Elden Ring, I think he said it was like 100.
Yeah, it's not huge, but it's not small.
Right. It's like right around that middle of the road size, but that's just big enough where like, he might have to start delegating, Right. I don't think he has art directors. I think he acts as like art director, which is pretty wild at that size. But I think that, like you have to start delegating at a certain size. And that becomes much more difficult because now you're not getting that direct vision, that direct leadership from that one particular person. You're getting a sort of small game of telephone as it passes down. And that's not even considering that like, it's not just that one person that's like, oh, I'm just speaking for the game director. It's a game director that has to say, hey, I want this as like a high-end vision, looking at Magic, right? It's like vision into experience. And then the experience designers, I might have that mixed up. whatever.
Yeah.
Then the experienced designers, they have to be like, okay, this is what Vision asked for. What is it that we want, and what would also be most beneficial and match this vision, the ask from Vision Design? And so it's this sort of mixed thing where it's like you're not just only getting that one person at the top and fulfilling exactly what they want. Everyone has their own nuances, their own wants, their own things that they want to put into this game as well, and their own personal ideas.
Right.
And so the more chains that sort of get created, it becomes a lot harder to maintain.
Right. Again, coming back to the sort of physical media side of this, and this is anecdotal, but something I was thinking about the other day. So in Portland, we have this place to rent movies still, right? It's like a Blockbuster. It's called Movie Madness. Super cool.
Yeah.
And one thing that struck me is that like it is a physical space, right? And that at some point in time you had decision makers. You had somebody who had to like sort of make the decision of whether or not a movie was worth the space on the shelf to put it on. And now that doesn't exist anymore, right? Digital space is essentially infinite. There's no real like curation happening. There's no sort of physical constraints being put on many of the games that are being created.
Right.
But when we look at Magic, this is still a game that exists in a physical space. It's sold theoretically through game stores in terms of like there is a space on the shelf for Magic, and there's sort of this I think forced level of quality that comes from the fact that you are bringing this thing into a physical space. It is there is a labor and a permanence, right? Like I was saying, to that design work, that the level of scrutiny in order to get something there. And I've experienced this as my own design experience in terms of like going from being a print graphic designer to being a web designer, and those two things are so vastly different. And the pressure that is put on me in terms of like, well, this thing is being sent to a printer and there's no way to change things. There's a monetary investment that happens up front when it goes to that printer. There's labor that happens when the thing is being printed. There's so much cost there that the level of scrutiny is so much higher.
Right. Once it's out the door, that's it. I mean, we talked about erratas, but that's not something any, I think, designer or team wants to do. It doesn't look good in the end, and it complicates things quite a bit.
So I think for, designers looking to enter the space and work on games, I think starting in physical media, I think to give yourself that experience of, needing that perfection on day one, I think is really important. Even if you can patch it later, why wouldn't you want to get it right the first time?
Right. I think that, I think us getting into tabletop games and trying to design that first has just been a huge boon to anytime we discuss video games, because I feel like there's tons of times that we'll end up seeing out in the news or some other thing if some game drops and like people are like, well, this isn't good, this doesn't work, this isn't finished, etc. And like it's I think where we how we've kind of come up as designers, we're like, ugh. Like we would never do that. Like in as much in our power as possible. Like we would never want that to be a thing. And the way you end up doing that, and you see most successful video game teams that sort of implement this, is early prototyping and being very fast and loose with their design, never being beholden to any sort of an idea, and I think really, really understanding when they're sort of going from the systems design level into mechanics design and understanding like, what does that mean? When can they leave it? What's finalized? What's not finalized? And like, how does that actually legitimately feel? Not, is it done? Does it function? Is this fulfilling, the things on a task board that we had of like, well, we want characters to be able to attack, and like, okay, great, cool. But like, is it actually a fun experience? And that just takes a ton of prototyping and a ton of playtesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I had something else to say about this.
Yeah.
I was kind of to wrap it up.
Games.
It's about magic.
Magic.
Permanence. Fuck.
Was it about how they prototype? Playtest?
No. Oh, whatever. Let's just do like and subscribe. It's fine.
All right.
You want to do it? Where's your playmat?
I don't know. What did we just talk about?
It's a good question. It was a little rambly.
Physical.
Why physical media is important? I don't know.
Well, this is gonna be weird if it's in the shot now, so I'm gonna set it there.
Yep.